As the scorching Arizona sun beat down on Winslow Station, Josephine Oliver clutched her empty coin purse and fought back tears of desperation, watching her last hope of escape pull away in a cloud of steam and coal smoke. The year was 1883, and Josephine Joe, to those who knew her well, had never felt more alone. At 23, she had journeyed west from Boston with dreams as vast as the frontier itself, only to find herself abandoned, penniless, and stranded at the dusty rail station that served as Winslow's tenuous connection to the civilized world. "Next train ain't due for 3 days, miss," the station master informed her with barely concealed impatience. "Can't have you loitering here without a ticket." Joe adjusted her travel-worn dress and straightened her back. "I understand, sir. I just need a moment to consider my options." Options that had dwindled to nothing when her traveling companion, a woman she'd met in St. Louis, who'd promised employment at a reputable hotel, had disappeared with Joe's savings the night before. The station master's weathered face softened slightly. "Town's got a boarding house, but they'll want payment up front. Church might help, but Reverend Porter's away till Sunday." Joe nodded politely, though panic constricted her chest. 3 days in this unfamiliar town with no money, no friends, and nothing but the clothes on her back and the small valise at her feet. She moved to a bench outside the station, the wood hot enough to feel through her skirts, and stared at the distant mountains shimmering in the heat. "Bad luck or bad company?" the deep voice startled her. Joe looked up to see a tall figure blocking the sun. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened by stubble and eyes that seemed to assess her predicament with unsettling accuracy. "I beg your pardon," she replied, clutching her valise closer. The man stepped aside, no longer eclipsing the sun, and Joe could see him clearly. Dust coated his denim pants and leather vest, marking him as someone who lived in the saddle. A cowboy, by the looks of him, though he carried himself with an assurance that suggested he might be more than a simple ranch hand. "Folks don't usually look that forlorn unless they've had a run of bad luck or trusted the wrong person," he clarified, his voice carrying a slight drawl. "Sometimes both." Joe debated how much to reveal to this stranger. Proper Boston upbringing cautioned against confiding in unknown men, but proper Boston upbringing hadn't prepared her for being stranded in a frontier town. "The latter, I'm afraid," she admitted. "My traveling companion absconded with my funds." The cowboy nodded as if this confirmed something. "Daniel Archer," he said, offering no hand but tipping his hat. "Most call me Dan." "Josephine Oliver," she replied. "Most call me Joe." "Where were you headed, Miss Oliver?" "Flagstaff." "I was promised a position at the Mountain View Hotel." Daniel Archer's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "Flagstaff's a day's ride by train from here. You have family there?" "No," Joe admitted. "No family anywhere west of the Mississippi." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of the town, a dog barking, the metallic clang from the blacksmith shop, horses' hooves on packed dirt. "Wait here," Dan said abruptly, and before Joe could respond, he strode into the station. She considered leaving, pride urging her to face her problems alone rather than accept charity from a stranger, but reality anchored her to the bench. Minutes later, Daniel Archer emerged from the station, a ticket in hand. "Train to Flagstaff leaves tomorrow morning at 7, he said, extending the ticket toward her. "This'll get you there." Joe stared at the ticket, then at the man. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." "Don't need to." His voice was matter of fact. "Been stranded myself a time or two." Nobody should be left without options. She hesitated, years of caution warring with desperate need. "I can't repay you, not immediately. Didn't ask for payment." "I can't accept charity," Joe insisted, though the ticket represented everything she needed. A hint of impatience crossed Dan's face. Then consider it an investment in Arizona's future. Territory needs more good people willing to work hard. Joe reached for the ticket, her fingers brushing his calloused ones. Thank you, Mr. Archer. I'll find a way to repay you. No need. He tipped his hat again. Boarding house is 2 streets over. Mrs. Holloway runs it. Tell her Dan Archer sent you. She'll put you up for the night. With that, he turned to leave. Wait, Joe called after him. How will I find you to repay you, I mean? Daniel Archer looked back, the shadow of a smile on his lips. Arizona territory's big, Miss Oliver, but not so big you can't find a man if you're determined enough. As he walked away, Joe clutched the ticket, her path forward restored by a stranger's unexpected kindness. She couldn't have known then that this brief encounter would alter the course of both their lives, or that the man disappearing into the heat waves rising from Winslow's Main Street would soon become the center of her world. Mrs. Holloway's boarding house proved to be a modest but clean establishment, with whitewashed walls and simple furnishings that spoke of practical frontier living. The proprietress, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes, scrutinized Joe thoroughly before Dan Archer's name softened her expression. Any friend of Dan's is welcome here, she declared, though her gaze remained evaluative. He's got good judgment about people, that one. We're not friends exactly, Joe clarified. We only just met at the station. He was kind enough to help me when I found myself in difficult circumstances. Mrs. Holloway's eyebrow arched. That sounds like him. Man's got a habit of collecting strays, people and animals both. She gestured for Joe to follow her upstairs. You'll have the room at the end of the hall. It's small but private. Supper's at 6 sharp. The room was indeed small, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked mirror above it, and a hook on the wall for clothing. But the sheets were clean, and after her ordeal Joe found it palatial. She washed her face and hands in the basin, changed into her one spare dress, and made her way downstairs when the grandfather clock in the hall struck 6. The dining room held a long table where several boarders were already seated, 2 older men who appeared to be railroad workers, a young schoolteacher, and a widow who introduced herself as Mrs. Parker. So you met Daniel Archer, Mrs. Parker said after introductions were made and plates of hearty stew were served. He's something of a local figure. Oh, Joe tried to keep her tone casual. In what way? Owns the Double Arrow Ranch about 15 miles outside town, one of the railroad men contributed. Started with almost nothing 5 years ago. Now runs one of the biggest cattle operations in the county. And he's not married? Joe asked before she could stop herself, then felt heat rise in her cheeks as the others exchanged knowing glances. No, not married, Mrs. Holloway said, her eyes twinkling. Though not for lack of interest from the local ladies. Dan Archer keeps to himself mostly, comes to town for supplies or business, sometimes stays a night when the weather's bad or he's shipping cattle. Otherwise, he's out at that ranch of his. He seems kind, Joe offered carefully. Kind enough, but hard too, the schoolteacher added. Had to be to build what he has. There are stories, she broke off as Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat pointedly. We don't trade in stories at my table, Miss Hayes, the older woman said firmly. Especially not about those who have been good to this town. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Joe's mind remained fixed on the mysterious cowboy who had restored her hope with a simple act of generosity. What stories circulated about Daniel Archer? And why had he really helped her? Later that evening, as Joe prepared for bed, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Holloway holding a small bundle. Thought you might need these for your journey tomorrow, the woman said, extending a package wrapped in brown paper. Just some biscuits and jerky. Train food's expensive and not worth the price. Thank you, Joe said, touched by this additional kindness. You've been very generous, especially to a stranger. Mrs. Holloway studied her for a moment. Dan doesn't help just anyone, you know. Man's careful with his trust. If he vouched for you, that's good enough for me. She turned to go, then paused. You heading to Flagstaff for certain? Joe nodded. I have a position waiting. At least, I hope I do. Well, if things don't work out there, Winslow could use a young woman of good character. We're growing this town. Opportunities for those willing to work hard. I'll remember that, Joe promised. That night, sleep eluded her despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept returning to Daniel Archer, the directness of his gaze, the unexpected kindness from a man who, by all accounts, kept to himself. She wondered if she would ever see him again to properly thank him, and why the thought of never seeing him again left her feeling oddly bereft. Morning came too soon. Joe gathered her few belongings, thanked Mrs. Holloway profusely, and made her way to the station as the first pink light of dawn spread across the eastern sky. The station master nodded in recognition as she presented her ticket. Train's due in 20 minutes, he informed her. Right on schedule for once. Joe took a seat on the same bench where her encounter with Dan had occurred. As the minutes ticked by, she found herself scanning the quiet morning streets, half hoping to glimpse a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat. But the town remained still, with only a few early risers moving about their business. The distant whistle of the approaching train pierced the morning quiet. Joe stood, gripping her valise, a strange reluctance suddenly weighing her down. The train appeared on the horizon, a dark shape trailing smoke against the brightening sky. Miss Oliver, the call came from down the street. Joe turned to see Daniel Archer astride a powerful chestnut horse, cantering toward the station. He pulled up at the hitching post, swung down from the saddle with fluid grace and strode toward her. Mr. Archer, she said, surprised and oddly pleased. I didn't expect to see you again. Wasn't sure I'd make it in time. He looked somewhat different today, cleaner, his face freshly shaved, wearing a crisp white shirt under his leather vest. You came to see me off? Joe asked, confusion mingling with something warmer in her chest. Dan hesitated, then reached into his vest pocket. Came to give you this. He extended a small envelope. Letter of introduction to Henry Wilson. He owns the Mountain View in Flagstaff. Joe took the envelope, their fingers brushing again. You know the owner supplied beef to his restaurant for 2 years. He's a fair man. Dan shifted his weight, seeming almost uncomfortable. Letter explains you're reliable, should help with the position. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and hissing steam. Passengers began disembarking, creating a bustle of activity around them. I don't know how to thank you, Joe said, genuinely moved. First the ticket, now this. No thanks needed. Dan's eyes met hers, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Just, if Flagstaff doesn't work out, all aboard for Flagstaff and points west. The conductor called out, breaking the moment. Joe glanced at the train, then back at Dan. If it doesn't work out, Winslow's a good town, growing, needs people willing to build something. He stepped back as other passengers began boarding. Safe travels, Miss Oliver. Joe clutched the envelope and her valise, feeling caught between two paths, the sure one leading to Flagstaff and the unknown one that somehow involved this enigmatic man. Thank you again, Mr. Archer, she said finally, moving toward the train. For everything. As the train pulled away from Winslow Station, Joe watched Daniel Archer grow smaller in the distance, still standing on the platform, his hat now in his hands. She couldn't know then that her journey to Flagstaff would be brief, or that her path would soon lead her back to Winslow, and to the man whose simple act of kindness had changed everything. Flagstaff greeted Joe with a bustle and energy that made Winslow seem sleepy by comparison. The Mountain View Hotel stood 3 stories tall on the main street, its facade impressively painted and its lobby gleaming with polished wood and brass fixtures. Joe smoothed her travel-wrinkled dress and approached the front desk with Dan Archer's letter clutched in her hand. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Wilson, please," she requested of the clerk, a young man with slicked back hair and a skeptical expression. "Mr. Wilson is a busy man," he informed her with the superior air of a gatekeeper. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I have this letter of introduction from Mr. Daniel Archer." Joe presented the envelope, noting how the clerk's demeanor shifted subtly at the mention of Dan's name. "I see. Wait here, please." Joe stood in the lobby, observing the well-dressed guests and efficient staff. The hotel was clearly prosperous, catering to wealthy travelers and businessmen. After several minutes, the clerk returned. "Mr. Wilson will see you now. This way, please." She was led to a wood-paneled office where a portly man with a magnificent mustache rose from behind a massive desk. Henry Wilson had the ruddy complexion of someone who enjoyed good food and drink, but his eyes were shrewd and assessing. "Miss Oliver, is it?" he said, taking the letter Dan had written. "Please have a seat while I read this." Joe sat nervously while Wilson perused the letter, his expression revealing nothing. Finally, he set it down and studied her more carefully. "Daniel Archer is not a man who writes letters of recommendation lightly," he remarked. "In fact, I believe this is the first I've received from him." "How do you know him?" Joe explained their brief encounter, leaving out the more embarrassing details of her situation but conveying Dan's generosity. Wilson listened attentively, nodding occasionally. "That sounds like Dan," he said when she finished. "Always was a good judge of character. Says here you're seeking a position. What experience do you have?" "I worked as a clerk in my father's bookshop in Boston for 5 years," Joe replied. "I'm educated, good with figures, and learn quickly." Wilson tapped his fingers on the desk, considering. "We need someone to manage the hotel accounts and correspondence. Previous girl got married last month. Position pays $30 a month, includes room and board. Hours are long, work is demanding." Joe's heart leapt. It was exactly the sort of position she'd hoped for. "I would be most grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Wilson. Dan vouches for you, that's good enough for me. You can start tomorrow. Martha will show you to the staff quarters." He rang a small bell and an older woman appeared promptly at the door. "This is Miss Oliver, our new accounts clerk. Get her settled, please." And just like that, Joe had secured her position. The staff quarters proved to be small but comfortable, and Martha, who managed the housekeeping staff, gave her a brief tour of the hotel. By evening, Joe was exhausted but elated. She had landed on her feet after all, thanks to Daniel Archer's unexpected intervention. As she prepared for bed, Joe took out a sheet of hotel stationery and began a letter. "Dear Mr. Archer, I hardly know how to express my gratitude." The days at the Mountain View Hotel fell into a steady rhythm. Joe proved adept at the accounting work, bringing organization to ledgers that had grown somewhat chaotic under the previous clerk. Mr. Wilson expressed his appreciation with a small raise after her first month, and Joe began to feel secure in her new life. Yet something was missing. She made acquaintances among the staff but few real friends. The guests remained at a professional distance. And though several young men in Flagstaff, including a bank teller and a lawyer's son, expressed interest in courting her, Joe found herself comparing them unfavorably to a certain taciturn rancher. She had sent her letter of thanks to Daniel Archer, care of the Winslow postmaster, but received no reply. This didn't particularly surprise her. Dan struck her as a man of action rather than words, but she found herself thinking of him often, wondering what stories lay behind the respect he commanded. 3 months into her employment, a commotion in the lobby drew Joe from her office. A group of rough-looking men had taken over the center of the room, their loud voices and aggressive postures causing other guests to give them a wide berth. Joe recognized their leader immediately: Jackson Wade, a cattleman known for his ruthless business practices and violent temper. "Wilson," Wade bellowed. "Get out here, you pompous fool." Mr. Wilson emerged from his office, his face carefully composed. "Mr. Wade, what can I do for you?" "You can explain why you've canceled your beef contract with me." Wade's hand rested meaningfully on his holstered pistol. "After 5 years of business, I've found a more reliable supplier," Wilson replied evenly. "Your last 2 deliveries were short-weighted and late." Wade's face darkened. "It's Archer, isn't it? You're buying from that upstart at the Double Arrow." Joe's heart jumped at the mention of Dan's name. "My business arrangements are my own concern," Wilson said firmly. "Now, I must ask you and your men to leave. You're disturbing my guests." "This isn't over," Wade snarled, jabbing a finger at Wilson's chest. "Archer's been taking my contracts all over the territory. I won't stand for it." "Your reputation for watered whiskey and crooked scales is what's costing you contracts, Wade," Wilson replied, his patience clearly thinning. "Not Daniel Archer's competition." Wade's hand twitched toward his gun, but one of his men grabbed his arm. "Not here, boss. Too many witnesses." With a final glare, Wade stalked out, his men following. The lobby gradually returned to normal, but Joe remained disturbed by the encounter. That evening at supper in the staff dining room, she asked Martha about it. "Bad blood between Wade and Dan Archer goes back years," the housekeeper explained. "Wade tried to run Dan off his land when he first settled there. When that didn't work, he's tried everything else: rustling cattle, poisoning wells, even hired guns." "That's terrible," Joe exclaimed. "Why hasn't the law stopped him?" Martha snorted. "Wade's got money and connections, and out here law's still catching up to the land." She buttered a piece of bread thoughtfully. "Dan holds his own, though. Man's got iron in his spine." "It sounds dangerous," Joe murmured, a knot of worry forming in her stomach. "Life in the territory's dangerous," Martha replied matter-of-factly. "But Dan Archer's not a man easily brought down." That night, Joe dreamed of Dan facing down Wade and his men, alone on the open range. She woke with his name on her lips and a certainty growing in her heart that Flagstaff, for all its opportunities, was not where she was meant to be. 2 days later, Wilson summoned Joe to his office. "Letter came for you," he said, holding out an envelope. "From Winslow." Joe's hand trembled slightly as she recognized Mrs. Holloway's neat handwriting. The letter inside was brief but alarming. "Miss Oliver thought you should know. Dan Archer was ambushed on the trail back from Holbrook. Shot twice. Doc Jenkins says he'll recover, but it's serious. Wade's men, everyone believes, though no proof yet. Dan asked about you when fever broke. Thought you might want to know." Mrs. Holloway. Joe read the letter twice, her heart pounding. "Mr. Wilson, I need to request leave. A friend is gravely injured." Wilson studied her face. "Archer." When Joe nodded, he sighed. "I heard rumors something had happened. Train leaves for Winslow at noon. Take 2 weeks. Your job will be waiting if you return." "If?" Joe questioned. Wilson's expression softened. "Been watching you these months, Miss Oliver. You do fine work, but your heart's not here. Never has been, I think." Joe opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. There was no point denying what Wilson had somehow perceived. "Thank you for understanding." By noon, Joe was on the eastbound train, her few possessions packed. her mind filled with worry for the man who had changed the course of her life with a single act of kindness. The journey to Winslow seemed interminable, though it was only a matter of hours. Joe stared out the window, barely seeing the spectacular landscape rolling by. Her thoughts were consumed by Daniel Archer, his quiet strength, his unexpected generosity, the unspoken connection she'd felt even in their brief encounter. What if she arrived too late? What if his injuries proved fatal despite the doctor's optimism? The possibility was unbearable. When the train finally pulled into Winslow Station, Joe practically flew down the steps, valise in hand. The town looked just as she remembered, though it felt different now, no longer a place of desperate stranding, but somehow a destination. She hurried to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, heart pounding with each step. The proprietress opened the door before Joe could knock, as if she'd been watching for her. "You came," Mrs. Holloway said, a mixture of surprise and approval in her voice. "Didn't know if you would." "How is he?" Joe asked immediately, dispensing with pleasantries. "Alive, stubborn, fighting infection but holding his own." Mrs. Holloway ushered her inside. "Doc moved him here 2 days ago, easier to care for him in town than out at the ranch. He's upstairs, first room on the right." Joe hesitated at the foot of the stairs. "Will he want to see me? We barely know each other." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. "Asked for you by name when the fever was highest. I'd say that means something." Taking a deep breath, Joe climbed the stairs and knocked gently on the indicated door. When no answer came, she pushed it open slowly. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Daniel Archer lay still on the bed, his normally tanned face pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. A chair had been placed beside the bed, recently vacated judging by the open book left upon it. Joe approached quietly, shocked by how vulnerable the strong cowboy appeared. Bandages wrapped his shoulder and torso, visible where the sheet had slipped down. Without thinking, she reached out to brush a lock of dark hair from his forehead. At her touch, Dan's eyes flew open. For a moment, confusion clouded his gaze, then recognition dawned. "Miss Oliver." His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Joe, I'm here," she said softly, fighting back tears. "Mrs. Holloway wrote to me. You came back." Wonder tinged his words. "From Flagstaff. Of course I came." Joe settled into the chair beside him. "How could I not, after what you did for me?" A ghost of his wry smile appeared. "Bought a train ticket. Hardly worth the return journey." "It was much more than a train ticket," Joe corrected him gently. "You gave me hope when I had none. A chance when I most needed it." Dan's eyes held hers, searching. "The hotel job, it worked out." "Yes, Mr. Wilson was very kind, thanks to your letter." Joe reached for the glass of water on the bedside table. "Here, you should drink something." She helped him raise his head slightly, holding the glass to his lips. Such intimacy with a man she barely knew should have felt improper, yet it seemed the most natural thing in the world. "Wade's men," Dan said after drinking. "3 of them. Waited in the rocks near Cedar Canyon. Mrs. Holloway told me," Joe replied, anger flaring at the thought of such cowardice. "Has the sheriff arrested them?" Dan's laugh turned into a grimace of pain. "No witnesses, no proof. But everyone knows it was Wade. Knowing isn't proving." Dan's eyes began to drift closed, exhaustion claiming him. "You shouldn't have come back. Not safe." "Rest now," Joe murmured, replacing the glass. "We can talk more when you're stronger." As Dan slipped back into sleep, Joe studied his face, noting the lines of character etched there, the strength evident even in repose. She had traveled back to Winslow on impulse, driven by concern and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Now, watching Daniel Archer fight for his life, Joe knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. The next few days established a new routine. Joe divided her time between helping Mrs. Holloway with the boarding house chores and sitting with Dan, whose condition improved slowly but steadily. Dr. Jenkins visited daily, changing bandages and pronouncing himself cautiously optimistic about his patient's recovery. "Man's got the constitution of an ox," the doctor told Joe after one examination. "Would have killed most men, those shots, but he's healing clean, fever's gone. Just needs time and rest now." As Dan grew stronger, he and Joe talked more. At first about simple things, the weather, the town gossip, Mrs. Holloway shared, books Joe read aloud to pass the time. Gradually, they ventured into more personal territory. "Why did you really help me that day at the station?" Joe asked one afternoon as sunlight streamed through the now open curtains. "The truth, Mr. Archer." Dan, propped up against pillows and looking more like himself, considered the question. "Daniel or Dan, please. After all this nursing seems strange to stand on formality." Joe smiled. "Dan, then, but you haven't answered my question." He looked at her directly, his gaze unwavering. "You reminded me of someone, myself maybe, when I first came west, determined but out of options." He paused. "And there was something in your eyes. Pride, but not the foolish kind. The sort that keeps a person going when everything else fails." Joe felt her cheeks warm under his scrutiny. "I was desperate but trying not to show it. You showed courage. That's rarer than you might think." Dan shifted slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wounds. "Your turn. Why did you come back from Flagstaff? Truth now." The directness of his question caught Joe off guard. She could have offered platitudes about gratitude and concern, but something in Dan's honest gaze demanded equal honesty in return. "I couldn't stay away," she admitted quietly. "When I heard you were hurt, I realized Flagstaff wasn't where I belonged. Not really." "And where do you belong, Joe Oliver?" His voice was soft, but the question hung heavy between them. Before she could answer, a commotion downstairs interrupted the moment. Raised voices, then heavy footsteps on the stairs. The door burst open to reveal a tall man with a silver star on his vest. Sheriff Taylor. Joe had learned his expression grave. "Dan," the sheriff said without preamble, "Wade's on his way to your ranch with at least 6 men. Got word from one of your hands who rode into town for help. Looks like they mean to burn you out while you're laid up." Dan was already trying to rise, face tight with pain. "My cattle, your men are moving the herds to the north pasture," the sheriff said, "but the house and barns are vulnerable." Joe watched in alarm as Dan swung his legs over the side of the bed. "You can't ride," she protested. "You'll tear your wounds open." "Can't stay here while Wade destroys everything I've built," Dan responded grimly. "I'm deputizing men now," Sheriff Taylor said. "We'll ride out within the hour." "But Wade's got a head start." Dan stood unsteadily, one hand pressed to his bandaged side. "My gear." "Downstairs," Mrs. Holloway answered from the doorway, her face pinched with worry. "But Daniel Archer, you are in no condition to sit a horse, let alone face down Jackson Wade." "No choice," Dan said simply, his face pale with effort. Joe made a quick decision. "Sheriff, how many men can you gather?" "Maybe 8, including myself. Not all experienced with guns." "And Wade has at least 6, all hired toughs," Joe mused aloud. "What if we could even those odds?" All eyes turned to her. Dan's expression was a mixture of pain and curiosity. "What are you thinking, Joe?" "A diversion," she said, the plan forming as she spoke. "If Wade believes you're still here in town, vulnerable, he might split his forces. Send some men to finish what they started with you while the others attack the ranch." Sheriff Taylor stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Could work. But how do we convince Wade you're still here? A slow smile spread across Joe's face. "Leave that to me and Mrs. Holloway." Within the hour, word had spread through Winslow that Daniel Archer's condition had worsened, that he was feverish and failing fast at the boarding house. Mrs. Holloway made a show of sending a boy for the doctor with an urgent message, while Joe purchased supplies at the general store, loudly asking the shopkeeper for medicines helpful for treating grave wounds. Meanwhile, Dan, despite his protests, was secreted to the back room of the sheriff's office, where he could rest while the deputies gathered. The sheriff's plan was simple: ride out to intercept Wade's men before they reached the Double Arrow, using the element of surprise that Joe's diversion might provide. "I'm coming with you," Joe informed Dan as he settled uncomfortably onto a cot in the sheriff's office. "Absolutely not," Dan responded immediately. "Too dangerous." "I didn't ask permission," Joe replied calmly. "I can ride, I can shoot, and I know the diversion was my idea, but I refuse to sit in town wringing my hands while you face Wade." Dan studied her face, seeing the determination there. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said finally. "I believe that's why you helped me in the first place," Joe reminded him with a small smile. "My stubborn pride." A ghost of a smile touched Dan's lips. "Touché, Miss Oliver." By mid-afternoon, a group of 10 riders, the sheriff, his deputies, several concerned citizens, and Joe dressed in borrowed men's clothing set out for the Double Arrow Ranch. Dan rode grimly in their midst, his face set against pain, refusing to be left behind. Joe stayed close to his side, watching for signs that his strength might fail. They rode hard, taking a roundabout route to avoid being spotted by Wade's men. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the Double Arrow, the sight below froze them all momentarily. Wade and his men had already reached the ranch. Smoke rose from one of the outbuildings, and figures moved purposefully between structures, clearly intent on destruction. "They're burning my barns," Dan said, his voice tight. "Bastards think they can run me off my land." Sheriff Taylor raised his hand, signaling the group to halt. "Looks like 6 men, like we heard. Don't see Wade himself, though." "He's there," Dan said with certainty. "Wouldn't miss watching this." "Your diversion worked, Joe," one of the deputies commented. "Could have been twice as many men down there." The sheriff outlined their approach: surround the ranch buildings from 3 sides, call for Wade and his men to surrender, and be prepared for resistance. Joe found herself assigned to stay with the horses at the rear, much to her frustration. "I didn't come all this way to hide," she protested. "You came to help," Dan reminded her. "And right now, the most help you can be is staying clear of flying lead." Reluctantly, Joe agreed to remain behind as the men spread out to encircle the ranch. She watched anxiously as they took their positions, then, at the sheriff's signal, revealed themselves. "Jackson Wade," Taylor's voice boomed across the ranch yard. "You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons." The reaction was immediate: shouts of alarm, men diving for cover, the crack of gunfire. Joe clutched the reins of the horses, her heart in her throat as she watched the scene unfold. She could make out Dan's figure, moving too quickly for a wounded man, positioning himself behind a water trough. Shots rang out in a confused exchange, dust kicked up by bullets peppering the ground. One of Wade's men fell, clutching his leg. Another threw down his weapon in surrender. The remainder, including Wade himself, retreated into the main house, firing from windows. "Archer." Wade's voice carried clearly. "I'm going to finish what I started at Cedar Canyon. Your ranch will be mine by sundown." The standoff continued, minutes stretching tenselessly. Joe strained to keep sight of Dan amid the chaos, fear gripping her heart each time gunfire erupted. Then, to her horror, she saw him break cover, moving toward the house in a crouched run. "Dan," she called out, forgetting all promises to stay back. But her voice was lost in the noise of battle. A flash from an upstairs window, a report of a rifle, and Dan staggered, going down on one knee. Joe didn't remember deciding to move. One moment she was with the horses, the next she was running across open ground, bullets kicking up dust around her. She reached Dan's side, finding him pale but conscious, clutching his arm where a bullet had grazed him. "What are you doing?" he demanded, pulling her down beside him behind a stack of crates. "Saving you from your own stubbornness," Joe retorted, tearing a strip from her shirt to bind the wound. "What were you thinking, charging the house?" Saw Wade moving to the back, Dan explained through gritted teeth. "He's trying to escape." As if to confirm his words, shouts came from behind the house. One of the deputies called out, "He's making for the horses. Wade's running." Without hesitation, Joe grabbed Dan's pistol from its holster and sprinted toward the rear of the house, ignoring his shout to stop. She rounded the corner to see Jackson Wade untying a horse from the back rail, his face contorted with frustrated rage. "Stop right there," Joe commanded, leveling the pistol at him. Wade froze, then sneered when he saw a woman holding the gun. "Get out of my way, girl. This isn't your fight." "You tried to kill Daniel Archer," Joe replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "That makes it very much my fight." Wade's hand moved toward his holster. "You won't shoot me. Women don't have the stomach for it." Joe adjusted her aim and fired, the bullet splintering the wood of the hitching post inches from Wade's hand. His eyes widened in shock. "The next one won't miss," Joe promised, just as Sheriff Taylor and two deputies arrived behind her, weapons drawn. "Wise decision to test that theory, Wade," the sheriff said dryly, moving forward to disarm the stunned cattle baron. "Miss Oliver, I believe Dan could use your assistance more than we need your gunslinging." Joe nodded, lowering the pistol with hands that only now began to tremble. She hurried back to Dan, who had managed to stand and was leaning heavily against the crates, his face ashen. "Wade?" he asked as she approached. "Sheriff has him," Joe confirmed, moving to support him. "Your arm, just a graze." "You shouldn't have," Dan began, then stopped, a different expression crossing his face. "Thank you." Joe smiled up at him, suddenly aware of how close they stood, how his arm had come around her shoulders. "I believe we're even now, Mr. Archer. One train ticket for one cattle baron." Something shifted in Dan's eyes, a warmth kindling there that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "Not even close, Joe Oliver. What you risked today. There's no comparing it." Around them, the scene was settling, Wade's men being rounded up, the small fire in the barn extinguished, ranch hands returning from the north pasture to assess the damage. But in that moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, standing amid the aftermath of violence, finding something precious in each other's gaze. "I think," Joe said softly, "this is where I belong if you'll have me." Dan's answer wasn't in words. He leaned down, wincing slightly at the movement, and kissed her gently at first, then with growing certainty. Joe responded in kind, her heart soaring with the knowledge that her impulsive journey back to Winslow had led her exactly where she was meant to be. When they finally broke apart, Dan rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said simply. "Not just for now, stay." "Yes," Joe replied, knowing it was both an answer and a promise, one she intended to keep for the rest of her days. The aftermath of the confrontation with Wade brought changes both immediate and far-reaching. Wade and his men were jailed in Winslow awaiting trial, though few doubted that Wade's connections would eventually see him released. The damage to the Double Arrow was relatively minor: a burned barn, some broken windows, fence posts that needed replacing, but the emotional impact ran deeper. "He'll try again," Dan acknowledged as he and Joe sat on the porch of the ranch house a week later. His wounds were healing well, though he still moved carefully. Wade doesn't forgive or forget. Joe sipped her coffee, watching the sunset paint the distant mesas in shades of gold and crimson. "Neither do you," she observed. "But you're stronger than he is, not just in body." Dan glanced at her, appreciation warming his gaze. In the days since the confrontation, they had fallen into a comfortable routine. Joe had moved to the ranch, ostensibly to help during Dan's recovery, a scandal by Boston standards, perhaps, but the frontier operated by different rules. Mrs. Holloway had packed Joe's belongings herself, her knowing smile suggesting she approved of the arrangement. "I sent a letter to Mr. Wilson," Joe continued, "explaining I wouldn't be returning to Flagstaff. He replied very kindly, said he'd suspected as much when I left." "And you're certain?" Dan asked, his tone careful. "The Double Arrow is no Mountain View hotel. Life's harder here, more isolated." Joe set down her cup and turned to face him fully. "Daniel Archer, if you're trying to give me an opportunity to change my mind, you can save your breath. I know exactly what I'm choosing." "Who I'm choosing?" The smile that spread across Dan's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Just making sure," he said, reaching for her hand. "Because I don't intend to let you go again, Josephine Oliver." The following weeks saw Joe integrating herself into ranch life with determination and enthusiasm. She learned to ride properly, side saddle abandoned in favor of the more practical split skirts worn by women who worked cattle. Dan taught her to rope, though her first attempts left them both breathless with laughter. She took over the ranch accounts, bringing order to Dan's haphazard record-keeping and uncovering several profitable opportunities he'd overlooked. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch or before the fireplace, talking of their pasts, their hopes, their dreams for the future. Joe learned that Dan had come west at 18, worked as a cowhand for years before staking his claim on the land that became the Double Arrow. He'd built it from nothing, against the opposition of established ranchers like Wade who resented his determination and success. In turn, Joe spoke of her life in Boston, her father's bookshop, her mother's death when Joe was 16, her decision to seek independence in the West after her father remarried a woman who made it clear Joe was unwelcome in the family home. "I never thought I'd find a home again," Joe confessed one night as they sat wrapped in a blanket on the porch, watching stars appear in the vast Arizona sky. "Certainly not because a stranger bought me a train ticket." Dan's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Not sure I believed in fate before meeting you," he admitted. "Now I'm not so sure." Their courtship progressed swiftly by Eastern standards, but at a pace that felt natural in their circumstances. By October, with autumn bringing cooler temperatures to the high desert, Dan rode into Winslow and returned with a small velvet box. That evening, as they walked along the creek that bordered the eastern edge of the ranch, he stopped beneath a cottonwood tree already shedding its golden leaves. "I'm not a man of many words, Joe," he began, taking her hands in his. "But I know what I want, and that's you. Beside me, building this ranch, this life, as my wife." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It's not fancy, it's beautiful," Joe interrupted, tears springing to her eyes. "And yes, Daniel Archer, yes, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows, Joe marveled at how a moment of desperation at Winslow Station had led to this, to love, to purpose, to a future brighter than any she could have imagined. They were married on a crisp November day in Winslow's small church. Mrs. Holloway served as Joe's matron of honor, while Sheriff Taylor stood up for Dan. The town turned out enforced storekeepers and ranchers, railroad men and schoolteachers, all coming together to celebrate a love story that had begun with a simple act of kindness. Even Mr. Wilson made the journey from Flagstaff, bringing with him a magnificent silver tea service as a wedding gift, and his best wishes for the couple he'd helped bring together. "Knew you two were meant for each other the moment I read Dan's letter about you," Wilson confided to Joe at the reception held at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. "Never seen the man put himself out for anyone that way before. Figured it had to be something special." The wedding night found them back at the Double Arrow, the ranch house transformed by Joe's touch over the preceding months. Curtains now hung at windows that had been bare, comfortable furniture replaced Dan's sparse bachelor furnishings, and flowers, the last of the season, adorned tables that had previously held only practical items. "Mrs. Archer," Dan said as he carried her across the threshold, his injuries now fully healed. "Welcome home." The words, simple, heartfelt, brought tears to Joe's eyes. "Our home," she corrected, kissing him as he set her down in the parlor. "Everything we build from here, we build together." Their life together settled into rhythms dictated by the seasons and the demands of the ranch. Winter brought snow to the high desert, transforming the landscape and keeping them close to home. Joe discovered talents she hadn't known she possessed for cooking, for animal husbandry, for the intricate dance of partnership that marriage required. Dan, for his part, found himself changed by Joe's presence, more willing to laugh, to share his thoughts, to envision a future beyond the next cattle drive or the next confrontation with men like Wade. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, expanding its operations and its reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. Spring arrived with renewal and unexpected news. Joe, who had begun to suspect a change in her body, received confirmation from Doc Jenkins during his monthly visit to check on the health of the ranch hands. That evening, she waited until they had finished supper to share her news with Dan. "I have something to tell you," she began, suddenly nervous despite the months of deepening love between them. Dan looked up from his coffee, instantly alert to the change in her tone. "What is it?" Joe took a deep breath. "Dr. Jenkins says we should prepare for a new arrival at the Double Arrow." "Around September." For a moment, Dan stared at her uncomprehendingly. Then understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a joy so pure it transformed his face. "A baby. We're having a baby," Joe nodded, tears of happiness spilling onto her cheeks. "Yes." Dan was out of his chair in an instant, gathering her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Joe," he breathed against her hair. "My Joe." He drew back to look into her face, his own alight with wonder. "Are you happy about this, truly?" "Happier than I ever thought possible," Joe assured him, placing his hand against her still flat stomach. "Our family, Daniel, the beginning of it." They stood together in the warm kitchen of the home they'd made, wrapped in each other's arms and the promise of the future they would build, a future that had begun with a young woman stranded without hope, and a cowboy who asked for nothing in return for his kindness. The months of Joe's pregnancy passed with both excitement and trepidation. Dan found himself becoming protective to a degree that sometimes made Joe laugh, sometimes made her gently remind him of her capability. "I'm with child, not made of glass," she would tell him when he tried to prevent her from her usual tasks. Yet she couldn't help but be touched by his concern, by the way he would place his hand on her growing belly each night, speaking softly to their unborn child about the ranch, the land, the legacy that would one day be theirs. In early September, as summer's heat still clung to the land, Joe went into labor. Dan rode for Doc Jenkins while Mrs. Holloway, summoned days earlier to assist, prepared the birthing room. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and determination for Joe, of fear and helpless waiting for Dan. When dawn broke over the eastern mountains, a new cry joined the awakening chorus of the ranch. Daniel James Archer, Jr., entered the world with his mother's determination and his father's strong lungs, a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would later reveal themselves to be his mother's warm brown. Dan, allowed into the room at last, approached the bed where Joe cradled their son with a reverence usually reserved for holy things. "He's perfect," he whispered, touching the tiny hand that immediately grasped his finger with surprising strength. "You're both perfect." Joe, exhausted but radiant, shifted to make room for Dan to sit beside her. "Your son," she said, passing the swaddled infant to his father's careful hands. "The newest archer of the double arrow." As Dan held his son for the first time, tears tracking unashamedly down his weathered cheeks, Joe was transported momentarily back to that day at Winslow Station, to the desperate young woman she had been, and the simple act of kindness that had altered the course of her life. "What are you thinking?" Dan asked, noting her distant expression. Joe smiled, reaching out to touch the faces of the two people who now constituted her entire world. "I'm thinking about train tickets," she said, "and how the smallest gestures can change everything." Dan nodded, understanding immediately. "Best investment I ever made," he said, leaning forward to kiss her gently. "Though I never imagined the return would be so great." Little Daniel, soon nicknamed Danny to avoid confusion, grew quickly, thriving in the clear air and open spaces of the ranch. He had his father's build and his mother's quick mind, showing an early affinity for both books and horses that delighted his parents. The years passed with the inevitable mix of joy and challenge that constitutes any life fully lived. The Double Arrow prospered, expanding its operations as Dan's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread throughout the territory. Joe, balancing motherhood with her role in managing the ranch's business affairs, found fulfillment beyond anything she'd imagined during her Boston days. Jackson Wade remained a shadow in their lives, though a diminished one. Released from jail as predicted, he made one final attempt to intimidate Dan by burning a lined shack on the far reaches of the Double Arrow. The response was swift, not just from Dan and his men, but from neighboring ranchers who had grown weary of Wade's tactics. Faced with united opposition and the loss of his political connections due to changing territorial leadership, Wade eventually sold his holdings and departed for California, leaving behind only bitter memories. When Danny was 4, the Archer family welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Rose, named for Joe's mother and Dan's grandmother. With her father's eyes and her mother's spirit, Lizzie, as she was inevitably called, completed their family circle. As their children grew, so did the legend of how their parents had met. The story of the stranded young woman and the cowboy who asked for nothing in return became a favorite bedtime tale, embellished over time but true in its essentials. It taught the Archer children about kindness without expectation, about how lives can pivot on small moments of decency, about the unexpected ways love can find its way to even the most practical hearts. On the 10th anniversary of that fateful day at Winslow Station, Dan surprised Joe with a special gift, the original train ticket he had purchased for her, framed alongside a photograph of their family standing before the Double Arrow Ranch house. "You kept it all this time?" Joe asked, tracing the faded printing on the ticket with wondering fingers. "Seemed important somehow," Dan admitted, his arm around her waist as they stood in the parlor of the home they'd built together. "Even then, I think part of me knew." Knew what? Joe asked, though the answer was written in the lines of love on his face. That you were my destination, he said simply. Not just a passenger passing through. Outside, Danny and Lizzie's laughter rang across the ranch yard as they played under the watchful eye of Mrs. Holloway, who visited regularly and had become a beloved grandmother figure to the children. The sound was joined by the lowing of cattle, the nickering of horses, the everyday symphony of the life they had created together. Joe leaned into her husband's embrace, thinking of all the paths that had led to this moment, the desperate departure from Boston, the betrayal that had left her stranded, the unexpected kindness that had restored her hope, and ultimately given her more than she had ever dreamed possible. "I love you, Daniel Archer," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Train ticket and all." His answering kiss held the promise of all the years still ahead, of children growing, of a ranch flourishing, of a love that had begun with a simple gesture of kindness and had grown into something as vast and enduring as the Arizona sky above them. "And I love you, Josephine Archer," he murmured against her lips, "now and always." As evening fell across the Double Arrow, painting the land in hues of purple and gold, the family gathered on the wide porch, Dan and Joe in the swing he had built when she was pregnant with Danny. The children sprawled on the planks playing a game of their own invention, the future stretching before them as wide and promising as the western horizon. From such small beginnings, a young woman stranded with no money at a station, a cowboy who bought her ticket and asked for nothing, had grown a legacy of love that would endure for generations. A story that would be told and retold among the archers of the Double Arrow long after its founders had returned to the earth they had cherished. And in every telling, the heart of the tale remained the same, that the greatest journeys often begin with the smallest steps, and that kindness offered without expectation can yield the richest of rewards, a truth as timeless as the love that had blossomed between a desperate young woman and the cowboy who had changed her life with a simple train ticket and an open heart.